The moment the helicopter doors opened, the moonlight was the first problem. 45 men stepped onto a remote island in the middle of the night, in the middle of an active war, carrying enough explosive to start a second one, and the moon above Pebble Island was blazing. The landscape stretched away in every direction, treeless, flat, offering no shadow, no cover, nothing to hide behind for as far as a man could see. 150 Argentine soldiers were garrisoned 6 kilometers away. 11 aircraft sat on a grass strip between those soldiers and the men who had just arrived to destroy them. The entire operation had come down to 30 minutes, not 90 as originally planned. 30. The wind had seen to that. This was the largest British SAS airfield raid since the Second World War. It would be over before most people finish a television program. What those 45 men accomplished in that half hour would ensure that 8,000 soldiers could land on a beach 6 days later without losing a single man to the aircraft designed to kill them. Tell me in the comments, had you ever heard of Pebble Island before today? Because what you are about to discover changes the entire story of how Britain won the Falklands War. Watch until the end. The last chapter of this story was written by the enemy. To understand why 30 minutes mattered more than anything else in the South Atlantic that spring, you first have to understand the arrogance of a calculation that went catastrophically wrong. On the 2nd of April, 1982, the armed forces of Argentina's military junta launched Operation Rosario, a full-scale amphibious invasion of the Falkland Islands, a British overseas territory 8,000 miles from London, populated by fewer than 2,000 people, nearly all of British descent, who had been there for 150 years. The junta's leader, General Leopoldo Galtieri, was a man under severe domestic pressure. Argentina's economy was in crisis. His regime's human rights record was generating international revulsion. The dirty war had produced tens of thousands of disappeared citizens, and the political situation was deteriorating by the month. The Malvinas, as Argentinians called the Falklands, had been a source of nationalist passion since the 19th century, and Galtieri's advisors assured him that seizing them would bury the regime's problems under a flood of patriotic pride. The calculation contained one catastrophic variable that nobody in Buenos Aires had adequately measured: Margaret Thatcher. The British garrison defending the islands on the morning of the invasion consisted of 68 Royal Marines, 11 naval hydrographers, and 23 volunteers of the Falkland Islands Defense Force. They fought for several hours at Government House in Stanley before Governor Sir Rex Hunt ordered a ceasefire and surrendered. The islands fell in a morning. Galtieri's advisors expected protests, emergency sessions at the United Nations, and eventual negotiation, because at government level and within the Ministry of Defense in London, the official assessment had long held that the military recapture of the Falklands was simply not feasible. 8,000 miles of open ocean, no nearby base, no contingency plan, no pre-positioned assets. The strategic logic of abandonment seemed overwhelming. Thatcher did not find it overwhelming. Within days of the invasion, the British cabinet authorized the assembly and dispatch of a naval task force carrying ground troops and air assets across 8,000 miles of open ocean to retake British sovereign territory by force. There were no contingency plans. There was no rehearsed operation. There was a carrier group, a collection of requisitioned civilian vessels, paratroopers, Royal Marines, and the iron will of a government that had decided the alternative was worse than the undertaking. The Argentine air forces waiting for them were formidable. Argentina possessed Skyhawk A-4 attack bombers, Mirage and Dagger interceptors, super-étendard naval strike fighters equipped with French-built Exocet anti-ship missiles, and the weapon that gave British ground commanders the most restless nights. The FMAIA 58 Pucara, Argentine designed and Argentine built, a twin turboprop ground attack aircraft created for exactly the wrong kind of war from the British perspective. It could operate from grass. It carried two 20mm cannons, four 7.62 mm machine guns, rocket pods, conventional bombs, and napalm. Rugged, low-flying, capable of loitering over a target in ways that high-speed jets could not, it had been designed for counterinsurgency operations, for hunting infantry in the open, for attacking vehicles on exposed roads, for breaking up formations of men who had nowhere to run. Everything that described its design purpose also described, in almost perfect detail, what a beach landing under fire would look like. Rear Admiral Sandy Woodward, commanding the British task force from his flagship HMS Hermes, had identified San Carlos water on the western coast of East Falkland as the landing site for the ground assault. The location offered terrain protection from Exocet attack and Argentine submarines, and its distance from Port Stanley would prevent a rapid enemy ground response. The problem was that directly to the north, on a wind-scoured 40-square-mile island called Pebble Island, the Argentines had established a forward air base whose aircraft sat within attack range of the landing approaches. If those aircraft were operational when British troops began going ashore, the beach at San Carlos would be strafed by ground attack planes for which the landing force had no adequate defense. There was one dimension to this problem that made it simultaneously more urgent and more difficult to resolve. Pebble Island had 22 civilian residents, British subjects, the very people the task force had been dispatched to protect, living close enough to the airstrip that any strike from altitude capable of destroying the aircraft would put those civilians at unacceptable risk. The pilots who could have bombed the base could not be authorized to do so. The aircraft had to be destroyed by hand. What made the situation more infuriating was that the Argentine Air Force and the Argentine Navy could not agree on who controlled what. The Fuerza Aérea Argentina had claimed the airfield at Goose Green on East Falkland as its own territory. The Comando de Aviación Naval stayed at Pebble Island with its T-34C Mentor trainers and Pucara detachment. The Argentine Army provided the garrison, 3 services, 1 grass strip, a command structure that functioned through argument rather than coordination. The result was a mixed force of aircraft from competing branches of the same military, defended by soldiers from a third branch, at a base assembled by improvisation and institutional dysfunction. Every aircraft on that strip was there because Argentina's armed forces could not agree on anything else. It was inter-service rivalry elevated to the level of strategic planning, and it had concentrated exactly the kind of isolated, vulnerable, high-value target that one particular British unit had been built to destroy. That unit had been created not in a headquarters building, but in a hospital bed in Alexandria, in the summer of 1941, in the mind of a junior officer named David Sterling, who had partially paralyzed himself in an unauthorized parachute jump and spent his recovery sketching a plan. Sterling's insight was deceptively simple. The Axis powers in North Africa had dozens of airfields, each with dozens of aircraft, and each aircraft required skilled ground crew, fuel, armaments, and maintenance. If small teams of highly trained men could reach those airfields silently and plant incendiary devices on the aircraft themselves, they could achieve with 6 men and a handful of bombs what entire air forces could not achieve from altitude. By the end of the war, His men had destroyed more than 250 Axis aircraft on the ground in North Africa alone. The regiment that arrived in the South Atlantic 40 years later carried that institutional memory in its bones. D Squadron, 22nd Special Air Service Regiment, was organized into 4 troops, each specialized in a different method of insertion. Air troop by parachute, boat troop by water, mobility troop by vehicle, mountain troop by foot across Arctic and mountain terrain. Different answers to the same question. How do you get men who should not be somewhere to a target that should not be reachable? Within the regiment, there is a tradition that gives the measure of the institution's relationship with loss. The names of soldiers who die on duty are inscribed on a clock tower at the regimental barracks. Those whose names appear there are said to have failed to beat the clock. It is a formulation that carries no false comfort and no theatrical grief, only the quiet acknowledgement that in the Special Air Service, the clock is always running. Before this story is over, the clock will matter. The squadron commander who would plan the Pebble Island operation was Major Cedric Delves, born on the 1st of March, 1947, commissioned into the Devonshire and Dorset Regiment, transferred to the Special Air Service, and by the spring of 1982, a veteran of Northern Ireland with 2 mentions in dispatches and a talent for moving faster than the bureaucracy that was supposed to govern him. He had already demonstrated in South Georgia that he operated on the principle of seizing opportunity before authorization could forbid it, capturing Grytviken with 2 troops initially deployed ashore and producing the first Argentine surrender of the war. He described the entire Falklands campaign in his memoir as a come-as-you-are party. No rehearsal, no contingency planning, no institutional preparation. What his squadron brought instead was the willingness to improvise at a pace that outran the enemy's ability to respond. The man Delves would send to lead the assault was a different kind of officer, younger, more directly physical, carrying a record that already defied easy summary. Captain Gavin John Hamilton was born on the 15th of May, 1953, in Harrogate, North Yorkshire. He had graduated from Sandhurst into the Green Howards, served in Cyprus, Belize, and South Armagh during Operation Banner, and in 1981 transferred to the Special Air Service at his own request, taking command of D Squadron's 19th Mountain Troop. He was 28 years old when Argentina invaded. In the weeks before Pebble Island, he had survived 2 helicopter crashes in hurricane-force winds on the Fortuna Glacier in South Georgia, crashes that destroyed both aircraft and could easily have killed everyone aboard. Then 2 days later led the advance elements that captured the main Argentine positions at Grytviken and accepted the first enemy surrender of the conflict. He was the kind of officer around whom legends accumulate not because he sought them out, but because he kept doing things that legends are built from and walking away. Before any of those 45 men could go near Pebble Island with explosive charges and intent, someone had to go there first with nothing but a canoe and the discipline to lie in cold peat for 3 nights without being found. That task fell to the 8 men of 17 boat troop. Gemini inflatable boats were rejected because their engine reliability in South Atlantic conditions was insufficient for an approach that needed to be silent and survivable. The alternative was the Klepper, a folding 2-man canoe of wood frame and waterproof canvas, non-metallic throughout, carrying nothing that could catch light or make sound. On the 10th of May, the 8 men of boat troop were put down by helicopter near Pebble Island. The sea was too rough for the primary landing zone, so they used the backup, then dismantled their canoes. With personal kit to carry alongside the equipment, 2 journeys were required. Darkness was running out before everything had been moved. They lay up through the entire day of the 12th in Deep Ferny Valley on Pebble Island, frozen and motionless, without establishing the observation post they had come to set up. A day behind schedule. On the night of the 12th to 13th, they moved. 2 men crawled forward to a position overlooking the eastern end of the airstrip. They counted the aircraft. 11. The intelligence was transmitted back to Hermes, though communication problems delayed the relay. What the boat troop had built, beyond the count, was something equally valuable. They had physically walked the approach routes from the water to the objective. They had crossed Keppel Sound in their canoes through water full of submerged rocks and violent currents. They had traversed the island in darkness over terrain that offered nothing to conceal a standing man. They had identified the Argentine sentry positions and confirmed the civilian settlement's location in relation to the target. The soldier who would guide the main raiding force on the night of the operation had walked these routes 3 nights running. He was not leading 45 strangers through unknown ground. He was taking them along paths he had already proven with his own feet. Aboard Hermes, planning proceeded against controlled urgency. The original design had called for a 90-minute window at the objective. Mountain Troop under Hamilton would assault and destroy the aircraft. Air Troop would screen the civilian settlement, preventing the Argentine forces there from reinforcing the garrison. Mobility Troop would hold in reserve. Captain Chris Brown of 148 Battery, 29th Commando Regiment Royal Artillery, would deploy as the Naval Gunfire Support Forward Observer, directing HMS Glamorgan's guns from a position between the settlement and the airfield. Glamorgan's opening salvos would target the western end of the runway, a deliberate deception designed to pull Argentine attention toward the settlement end of the strip, while the assault came from the opposite direction entirely. Then the reconnaissance data forced a brutal revision. The headwinds between Hermes's intended launch position and the target would add significant transit time, stripping the operational window from 90 minutes to 30. Hamilton rebuilt the plan around a single priority. The aircraft first, everything else secondary. Every troop disposition was reconsidered through the lens of what 30 minutes could contain. Each man loaded what those 30 minutes would require. A 50-pound pack, 30 pounds of webbing, an M16 rifle with an underslung M203 40mm grenade launcher, at least 2 81mm mortar bombs carried for the support teams, light anti-tank rockets, PE4 plastic explosive and thermite grenades, 400 to 600 rounds of machine gun ammunition. The weight per man was extraordinary, not for a stealth patrol but for a raiding party that would sprint across an open moonlit airstrip after carrying that load for 6 kilometers in the dark. A mechanical fault in one of the Sea King helicopters caused a 1-hour delay on the flight deck. The men waited. When the aircraft finally lifted, they flew at sea level, blacked out in near hurricane winds, the pilots navigating with night vision goggles in one of the first operational uses of that technology in British naval aviation. The Argentine garrison ahead had no equivalent capability. Below the helicopters, the water was black and freezing. Delves had said it plainly in a BBC interview after the war. As soon as we were on land, we were masters of our destiny. Not before. Not during the management of naval commanders and fleet priorities. Only when the helicopter door opened and the only remaining variable was what his men did. At 23:45 on the 14th of May, 1982, the Sea Kings put down at Phillips Cove, 6 kilometers from the airstrip. The boat troop soldiers, who had been on the island for 3 nights, materialized from the darkness to meet the arriving force. One of them took point. They moved. The moonlight, as the men stepped off and began their advance, was immediately and entirely the enemy. The Falklands landscape at night offers concealment for a rabbit and nothing larger. No trees, no hedgerows, nothing above knee height, the low moorland rolling in shallow undulations that light would have illuminated to the horizon. 45 men moving across that ground in near full moonlight were visible at distances that no amount of tactical discipline could fully overcome. There was no solution. There was only movement, silence, and the clock. Cut-off teams peeled away to their positions as the column closed on the objective. The mortar team established its tube in a depression. Machine gun positions were set, the crews receiving the mortar bombs and ammunition that every passing trooper deposited at the staging point on his way through. Captain Brown found his position between the settlement and the airfield's eastern end, maintaining communication with Glamorgan offshore and with the troops moving toward the aircraft. Then, as the assault element reached the edge of the strip, they spotted an Argentine sentry. He did not spot them. Every man in the patrol held absolutely still. The sentry completed his circuit and moved on. The patrol resumed. Hamilton brought mountain troop to the airstrip's edge. The silhouettes of the aircraft resolved out of the dark, the Pucara tallest, the Mentors lower and sleeker, the Skyvan heavier and squarer. They were dispersed across the width and length of the strip, placed wherever available surface had seemed appropriate when each aircraft arrived. The 7 two-man demolition teams looked at what stood between them and success. 11 aircraft, 30 minutes. The mortar opened up. Illumination rounds burst above the strip and turned the night into something that was not daylight, but was everything required. The soldier firing the mortar was having considerable difficulty. The base plate was sinking further into the soft ground with every round, requiring constant repositioning. He fired anyway. At the same moment, 30 kilometers offshore, Glamorgan's 4.5-inch guns opened fire on the western end of the runway. The shells arrived with a sound that could be felt in the chest, and the Argentine garrison received the message that something enormous was happening at the far end of their base before they understood it was also happening in the middle. The 7 teams split and ran. What happened next was not technologically sophisticated. It could not have been. 2 men arrived at the base of a Pucara. One planted his hands and offered his knee as a step. The second climbed onto the wing, cold aluminum, slick with condensation, the metal shuddering faintly under their weight. He reached back and hauled his partner up beside him. The cockpit glass was smashed with a rifle butt. A thermite grenade wrapped in PE4 plastic explosive, fitted with a 4-second fuse, was thrown through the broken glass into the cockpit. 4 seconds. They jumped from the wing, hit the frozen ground, and ran. Behind them, the aircraft detonated. Not the concussive roar of a bomb dropped from altitude, but the contained, directed violence of an incendiary charge inside an enclosed space. The kind of destruction that is surgical in its precision and total in its effect. Each charge had been designed with a specific additional purpose. No part salvaged from one burned aircraft could be used to repair another. These planes were not merely destroyed, they were unmade. 5 aircraft went this way. The Mentors were smaller, reachable with a running jump onto the wing. The Skyvan required a different approach, but fell to the same principle. For the 6 aircraft beyond the time available for explosive charges, the teams used their rifles, their grenade launchers, and their rockets. Undercarriages were shot away, fuel tanks were punctured, control cables were destroyed at point-blank range through shattered cockpit glass. This was Sterling's method. Incendiary devices in enemy cockpits, darkness, speed, withdrawal before dawn, executed 4 decades later in a different hemisphere with the same result. Glamorgan shifted fire to the garrison buildings and then to the fuel stores. The fuel stores went up in a column of orange fire, visible to sailors aboard Glamorgan 30 kilometers away, rising into the sky in a manner that would have made the island visible for miles in every direction. The ammunition dump followed in a chain of detonations that rolled across the airstrip like successive thunderclaps, the ground shuddering beneath the feet of men still working on the last aircraft. The Argentine garrison's response during all of this was conspicuous by its absence, and its absence had a cause that nobody on either side had fully anticipated. The Argentines had mined their own airstrip. Demolition charges placed beneath the runway surface were intended to deny it to an enemy force in the event of a full-scale assault. In the chaos of Glamorgan's bombardment, the SAS mortar fire, and the explosions of their own aircraft, someone in the garrison triggered those charges. The detonation shook the ground across the entire field. One SAS soldier moving through the target area was caught by shrapnel from a charge detonating near him, a light wound, treatable, survivable. A second man was concussed. Inside their buildings, listening to their own demolition charges going off alongside naval shells and mortar rounds and burning aircraft, the Argentine garrison apparently concluded that a full-scale combined assault was underway. They stayed in their shelters. The enemy's own panic had, entirely by accident, shielded the men who came to destroy them. By British assessment, the Argentine commanding officer was killed by return fire during the brief engagement as the SAS formed up for withdrawal, a claim that Argentine sources neither confirm nor fully contradict. What is not in dispute is this. By the time the raiding party began moving back to the landing zone, the garrison had no effective combat capability and offered no organized resistance to the withdrawal. 30 minutes after the mortar had opened, the last SAS man left the strip. 6 Pucara ground attack aircraft, destroyed. 4 T-34C Mentor trainers, destroyed. 1 short sky van utility transport, destroyed. The ammunition stores, gone. The fuel supplies, burning. The radar installation, dismantled. Every aircraft on Pebble Island, non-flyable, permanently, by anyone. 2 British soldiers lightly wounded. 0 British dead. The Sea Kings were at Phillips Cove when the men arrived. The force loaded their wounded, their equipment, and themselves, and lifted off into the dark. In the small hours of the 15th of May, 45 men sat down to a full English breakfast aboard Hermes. If you have made it this far, drop a comment below with the word Pebble. Because what comes next is the part that the official histories either footnote or omit entirely. 5 days after the raid, on the 19th of May, a Sea King helicopter was transferring Special Air Service personnel from Hermes to HMS Intrepid when it struck the sea and went down. 19 men died. Some of them had been on Pebble Island. In the regiment's tradition, those men failed to beat the clock. Their names are inscribed on a wall at Hereford Cathedral, alongside every name that preceded them. The crash did not diminish what the survivors had accomplished 5 days earlier. It placed that accomplishment inside the full human reality of what the campaign had cost, not only in deliberate combat, but in the ordinary catastrophic accidents that war produces alongside its intended violence. The morning after the raid, a Sea Harrier reconnaissance flight had photographed what the night left behind. Burned frames of aircraft broken on the grass, some reduced to their structural spars, others scattered by secondary explosions. Those photographs were released. In Britain, where the public had been watching HMS Sheffield sink by Exocet missile on the 4th of May and waiting anxiously for evidence that the task force could impose its will on the conflict, those images provided something that went beyond tactical significance. The debate about whether the raid served military necessity or political necessity, or both simultaneously, has never been fully resolved. Historians still argue whether it was a strategic coup or a public morale gesture. That argument deserves to be taken seriously and then answered on its own evidence. Argentina flew 4 replacement Pucara aircraft from the mainland the very next day. They arrived at a base with no fuel, no ammunition, a partially destroyed runway, and a demoralized garrison. The replacement aircraft were not a strategic reversal. They were a gesture from a distance, arriving after the window that mattered had permanently closed. That window shut definitively on the 21st of May, when Operation Sutton commenced, and 8,000 British troops went ashore at San Carlos Water. The Argentine Air Force that day was ferocious. 12 aircraft were shot down, but they sank HMS Ardent and pushed the landing operation to the edge of what was tolerable. Pucara aircraft from Goose Green flew ground attack missions against Special Air Service positions directing naval gunfire, strafing until one was shot down by a trooper using a shoulder-fired Stinger missile he had not been fully trained on. The aircraft from Pebble Island were not there. Had those 11 aircraft been operational that day, flying alongside the Goose Green force, the ground attack threat at the most critical moment of the entire campaign would have doubled. The beach was not strafed from the north because those aircraft burned on the 14th of May. That is not conjecture. It is the logical extension of what actually happened 6 days later with the Pucara force that had survived. The Pebble Island garrison was evacuated on the 1st of June. They left behind wreckage and played no further role in the war. The raid's final chapter was not written at Pebble Island, but on a hillside above Port Howard on West Falkland, 26 days after the helicopters lifted off. After the operation, Hamilton did not rest. On the 21st of May, the same night that British troops were landing at San Carlos, he led the surviving remnant of his troop in a diversionary raid on Darwin. His Military Cross citation notes with characteristic understatement that he accomplished this even though his troop had lost half of its strength in a helicopter crash the previous day. Half his men were dead. He went back into the dark with the ones who remained. In late May, Hamilton's troop deployed 40 miles behind Argentine lines to establish observation positions overlooking the main enemy defensive positions at Port Stanley. His work in securing the high ground at Mount Kent, from which the final British assault on Stanley would be launched, was described in his citation as proving instrumental in seizing this ground. On the 5th of June, he was deployed in command of a 4-man patrol behind enemy lines on West Falkland to observe Argentine activity at Port Howard, establishing an observation post 2,500 meters from Argentine positions and transmitting detailed, accurate intelligence reports for 5 days. On the morning of the 10th of June, 1982, Hamilton and his signaller, Corporal Roy Fonseca, found themselves surrounded in their forward position by troops of the 1st Section, 601st Commando Company. Heavily outnumbered, with no reinforcement available, and no withdrawal route that was not under direct observation by the encircling force. Hamilton made his decision. He ordered Fonseca to move first, then initiated a firefight to draw enemy fire onto himself while his signaller ran. He was wounded in the back. He continued firing. Fonseca escaped. Shortly afterward, Hamilton was killed. He was 29 years old. The Argentine garrison at Port Howard buried him with full military honors. Colonel Juan Ramon Mabragana, the Argentine commander, told British interrogators following the surrender, "The most courageous man I have ever seen." He asked that the British award Hamilton a gallantry decoration. The officer who had ordered his men to hunt and surround Hamilton requested that the country which sent him recognize what he had done. Hamilton received the Military Cross posthumously, the first person in the history of that decoration to receive it posthumously. At the investiture at Buckingham Palace, his widow Vicky, his sister Jane, and a fellow officer attended the ceremony. The Queen, who had clearly read the citation in full, told them quietly that she was surprised it was not a higher award. His grave in Port Howard Cemetery is still tended by the residents of Port Howard, who have, in Jane's words, adopted him as their special person. It sits among 26 graves inside a small cemetery, bordered by a white fence on a hillside beside a bay, roughly a mile from the settlement, one grave among islanders who spent their lives there, belonging to a man who spent 6 weeks. 4 days after his death, Argentina surrendered. The official histories of the Falklands War have treated Pebble Island with the particular condescension reserved for things that are undeniable but inconvenient to fully honor. It appears as a paragraph, a bullet point, a footnote appended to larger narratives about Goose Green and the march to Stanley. The debate about military necessity versus political theater continues in the margins of academic accounts, largely written by people who were not on the grass at midnight. What is beyond debate is what the raid proved about proportion, about the relationship between the number of men committed to a problem and the scale of what they can achieve when those men are the right men. 45 soldiers accomplished in 30 minutes what would have required multiple airstrikes with unacceptable civilian risk. They accomplished it without a single death against a force 3 times their size, in conditions that any reasonable analysis would have classified as prohibitively difficult. They did it using a method identical in every essential respect to the one David Stirling had conceived in a hospital bed in 1941. Small teams, night approach, airfield penetration, incendiary devices, withdrawal before dawn. 30 years of technological development had not improved on Stirling's formula. The only thing that changed between North Africa and Pebble Island was the name of the ocean. The wreckage is still there. The burned frames of the Pucara and T-34C aircraft remain in the Falklands peat, slowly returning to the earth, decades of wind and salt completing what the thermite charges began. Visitors over the years carried away souvenirs, cannon barrels, propeller blades, pieces of cockpit glass, so that what remains is incomplete, but it remains. The most permanent memorial to the operation is not a plaque, it is wreckage. In 2022, as part of the 40th anniversary commemorations, a geographical feature on West Falkland was named Hamilton Point at the exit of Double Stream into Port Howard, near the place where he died. A street at the British military base on the islands was named after him as well. Small gestures measured against what they mark. There is a verse inscribed at the base of the regimental clock tower at the Special Air Service Barracks in Hereford, drawn from a poem by James Elroy Flecker. "We are the pilgrims, master. We shall go always a little further. It may be beyond that last blue mountain barred with snow, across that angry or that glimmering sea. The men whose names are on the clock failed to beat it. The men whose names are not there kept walking. In a small cemetery on a hillside above Port Howard, there is a grave tended by people who were never asked to tend it and who have never stopped. The man buried there was 29 years old. He spent 30 minutes destroying 7 aircraft and then went straight back to work until there was no work left. The enemy who killed him asked that he be honored. The Queen thought the honor inadequate. His signaler lived because Hamilton turned and walked into the fire first. When you hear today about Special Forces operators conducting small team raids against targets that cannot be reached by conventional means, in places that will never appear in any public account, they are carrying a doctrine whose most important modern proof is a grass strip on a remote island at the edge of the South Atlantic, still marked by wreckage that has been rusting in the wind since the 15th of May, 1982. The clock is always running. The pilgrims keep going. And the burned aluminum in the Pebble Island peat quietly proves, for anyone willing to look, that sometimes the most irreversible things in history are accomplished by the fewest people in the least time. Now you know